So actually, the four of us have just really come from a day at the studio. We're in full production over at LAIKA. I'm allowed to say, even though we have many a contract and things, it's a very, there's a lot of things that we can't talk about in this conversation, but there's so much that we can. And I'm very excited to begin with that. But I can also first off by saying that we are working on a film, Wildwood. It's actually a young adult fantasy novel based out of Portland. So if you're interested in the story, you could actually read it yourself. But before we really jump into all of that, can I ask that I'm just going to allow everyone to introduce themselves. So I'm just going to pass it off from person to person. So I'm going to start off with Erica.
Sure. Hi, thanks, Anna. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be asked to speak tonight. I'm Erica Benoit, and I am calling in from Portland, Oregon. I am currently an assistant production manager of practical effects at LAIKA, which is, as the name might sound, a little bit production management, and it's mostly for things that are physically made by hand, the things that we actually produce in the studio, and just helping to keeping everybody on track with schedules and spreadsheets and all that stuff. I do come from theater. I'm not doing it anymore because I stepped into this world, but I have a background as a props artisan, technician, touring technician, and various other hats as well, as many of us do. I'm going to pass it on to Megan.
Hi, I'm Megan Wilkerson, she, her. I'm here in Portland as well. I am currently an assistant art director for LAIKA, and I am also a set designer for theater. And I think it's Alexandra.
Oh, it's Anastasia.
Anastasia, I'm sorry, Anastasia. It's been a long pandemic.
Yeah. So I'm Anastasia. My pronouns are she, her, they, them. I am Wenatchee Inuit, enrolled in the Colville Confederated Tribes. I'm also a Hopi. I work at LAIKA as a puppet production assistant. And I actually got my start in the entertainment industry in theater in New York City several years ago. So it's nice to be in this panel doing this work again. I'm excited. And I'm also just a multimedia conceptual performance artist as well.
Great, and everyone kind of heard from me saying hey, Anna Driftmier, I'm an art department coordinator, specializing in the model shop. So at LAIKA, so all the small tiny things that interact with set dressing, interiors, every odds and ends. Everyone who knows props knows that it basically is everything becomes a gray zone becomes props. Everything that becomes a gray zone in stop motion becomes model shop. Also, just to kind of put into context the world that we're speaking about as we continue on, I actually have a little bit of a presentation for those who want to see some behind the scenes of our workshops and various films. Unfortunately, can't show anything that we're working on right now, but I think everything that's been produced in the past, and many of you may recognize a lot of the characters and a lot of the scenarios, those are all very much things that I can show. So I'm just going to quickly jump into this. So we're going to come straight into this. So this is LAIKA. So hopefully everyone can see this. There we go. Great. So welcome to LAIKA. LAIKA's been around. It's a stop motion animation studio that actually blends a lot of live action, actually real physical manipulated puppets, combining with CGI, VFX, with this whole entire blended technology. They're always utilizing, actually it's really interesting, utilizing older forms of animation with newest forms of technology, both on the CGI front, as well as on the actual physical front. It's been a really exciting place to be in, basically be surrounded constantly by a group of inventors and creatives and artists, really at the top of their game. So just a little bit of information about them. Started off in 2005. First film was Coraline, which is considered a modern classic in animation. Many of you may recognize that. A lot of iconic costumes and figures and sets and moments, which admittedly are still in existence. So we they kind of go on tour sometimes. You can always go and they tend to tour the world as well. So you ever want to see these in real life, just look it up and maybe you can find them nearby. So just looking in terms of filmography, 5 films so far. We are officially working on film 6, which is gearing up to be the biggest yet. As sweat kind of begins to kind of build up around around all of us, so we begin to think about it. But I mean, it's really like full of just wonderful characters and ultimately just beautiful, beautiful, exquisite craftsmanship. I always say that marketing shouldn't even be in the film, the marketing should be in the artist, because really that's really what everyone wants to see are the behind the scenes. Awards, blah, blah, blah. Iconic Pink Palace, Coraline. But then also I'm gonna begin this off just with a quick little run through of the workshops with Raul, friend and co-worker. So Raul making from Kubo, making the skeleton, Raul in box trolls, making one of his pieces. I think that actually that machine ended up winning a couple of awards. He's amazing, he's super talented. So I started off with Raul. Again, working on Missing Link, on the forests for making Missing Link, that's our landscapes department. This is working on some of the gates for Kubo with our scenic artists. So as you can see, already begin to see when in terms of the world of like theater and stop motion, things are starting to look very familiar, just a different scale. This is our puppet department working with the incredible animatronics and mechanics and like what we deal with day to day. I mean, the level of craftsmanship, a lot of from computering all the way to molding and casting is just utterly exquisite and really does constantly ask for like near perfection on a really admirable and sometimes slightly questionable level. So then also working in terms of like basically planning out the movements of characters and the characters of characters and how the actual animatronics and all the mechanics underneath them actually end up informing their entire world. Many of those who come from stop motion will be like, yeah, we know this, but many of us who don't will be have their minds blown by these techniques that are actually within another industry are quite normal. Working on the boat from Kubo, just laying down all the thousands of leaves. This is from Coraline, making the iconic garden. This is from, I believe that's also from Missing Link, making the forests. And then finally, from Kubo, vacuuming up little bits of things on the ground. So that's this is a great way of kind of putting an introduction into like kind of the world that we inhabit every single day, all day long, 5 days a week, making films, constantly making and creating and organizing and planning. And then, so this kind of runs into the first question that I'm going to have open up to our panelists is like, how did you find yourself here? Megan, laugh loudest, I'm going to pass it on to you.
Yeah.
Oh, great. That's going to backfire on me. How did I find myself here? I was living in Portland, honestly. It was actually through the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. On one level, I came to Portland. I came to Oregon actually to work for OSF. I'd been in the Midwest for many years, and I decided I was going to take a slightly different direction. And so I did 2 years in the design studio as an assistant at OSF about 11 years ago now, probably. I decided not to leave, essentially. I decided not to go back to the Midwest for a myriad of reasons. And came to Portland as it was I let a guy pick me up in a wine bar in Ashland, essentially, is what happened. And he is from Yonkers, and he never wanted to go back to anything essentially east of the Rockies. So here we are. And Portland was our middle ground, essentially. I wanted to go back to Chicago. He wanted to stay in Ashland. So here we are. And in terms of LAIKA, I had been here for about 9 years. freelancing, I teach, and I was doing fine, but it wasn't enough anymore. And so I had actually applied to LAIKA when I first moved to Portland for a set design job, because their old, one of the previous art set designers and art directors used to be an assistant at OSF. So there is definitely on the West Coast, and particularly in Oregon, I would say a little bit of an OSF mafia that you kind of, if you've been there for a season or two, you kind of get hooked into. And so that was really, you know, even when I came back later, I didn't get the initial job, but when I decided to apply for an art direction job, the production designer remembered me from then. And that was, so that was kind of part of how it happened. And I just decided it was time to do something a little bit different, and I wanted to try it. So that's how that happened. Does that answer the question, Anna?
I think anything you answer the question, because
okay, great.
We all have such different roots to like what found us in the studio.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Erica, I can pass it on to you.
Yeah, thanks. It's funny because I'm about to echo a number of things that Megan said, and some of them I didn't even know until this conversation. I also arrived in Oregon to work at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, but that was many, many years ago, probably over 15 years ago now, and spent a wonderful, I think, 6 or 7 years down there in Ashland, working with the props team down there. It was an excellent time, and I learned a ton in my career from that team. They're fantastic. Yeah, after we did our time in Ashland, and then life had us move on, as many of us find. We find ourselves moving around. We spent some years working in Las Vegas, and then decided that maybe Portland was more our speed once again. So when I found myself in Portland, I started out doing freelancing. I was excited to have the opportunity to freelance. I thought, okay, here I am. I've done props, I've done lighting, I've done some scenic art, you know, like maybe it's time for me to get myself into production management, venue management, what have you. And that's kind of how I ended up putting those things together. Freelancing was good for a bit, but it's also, as Megan can attest, not really the bread and butter that you need it to be out here. So it's always about, many people in Portland, I think, will tell a story of putting together very many different jobs in order to make a living doing it. And I also found myself having to leave Portland quite a lot to work. So I was leaving to work in different places and to tour occasionally and things like that. So I started looking at LAIKA because, weirdly enough, I thought there might be more stability in a studio, a full-time studio job. And I was interested in film because it was something I hadn't done yet. And I thought that perhaps taking my skills into film might lead to more money. Spoiler, not really true. But the stability part of the studio did actually turn out to be true. Much like Megan, I also had applied several times over several years for many different positions to try to get into LAIKA. And initially, I actually thought that I would find myself going into the model shop because I came from a props background. But it turns out that that was actually, the work is so specialized at LAIKA because of the miniature nature of it that you may have the right skill set coming in, but if you don't have some of that miniature, you know, example in your work, they have so many people who do have it that it can be a difficult thing to get in on those skills. So I went back to the production management route, and my family and I actually spent a year living in China for my husband's work. And when we came back from that, I said, this is it. I want to throw my hat in again and see if LAIKA is going to take me this time. And I don't know, they fell for it. So I came in with sort of a production management, stage management background, and they figured they could give me a try as a second AD. And so that was on Missing Link. And that was a really fascinating experience. Being an AD on the floor is a lot like stage management. It's just that you have 20 little stages that you're working with simultaneously instead of one big one. So that is how I got here.
Amazing. And thanks, last but not least, Anastasia.
So I did not come here through the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. I guess, well, I'm originally from here. I grew up in Vancouver, Washington, just across the river, and then eventually left for New York City. And in New York City, I worked a lot with the La Mama experimental theater and a lot of the native theater groups there. Worked with Kate on a few different things. But living in New York City, you have to make a lot of money to live there, and there wasn't a lot of money working in theater. And I eventually got a job working on a network animated series, Our Cartoon President. It's like a Stephen Colbert show about Trump. And I started doing that, and it was kind of nice to go from being very active on theater sets and then kind of working in more of an office style job, but still like in the arts. And during the pandemic, though, things kind of shut down. I was offered a job right before that to be a prop designer, and the pandemic happened, and then that show never happened. And so then I decided it was time to move back home. So I moved to Portland, Oregon, and I had always wanted to work at LAIKA. I grew up watching like Coraline and all the movies. And I also really liked how, because I had fallen in love with animation and working in animation, and LAIKA was kind of 2D animation mixed with theater. And I really was excited about getting back to that more like tactile art form rather than just staring at screens all day, even though I do still stare at screens all day. So I applied to be a puppet production assistant because while I was working in animation in New York City, I did start off wanting to be more of an artist, working in like layout and rigging. But I did like the security of working in more production management type roles. Instead of being on a job for weeks or months at a time, it was more like a year contract, which is, it's just kind of nice sometimes to know that I'm going to get paid for a little bit longer. So then coming to LAIKA, I went for the puppet production assistant role, knowing that I would be kind of going down the same path, but with stop motion. So that's how I ended up here.
So can I say that I feel like maybe I can potentially be the bridge between these two groups, because whilst pandemic is really kind of what brought me to reconsider a lot of like aspects of my life, and also recognizing that in the many ways the pandemic expedited a lot of personal creative journeys that were going to happen eventually in my life. They just happened about 6 or 7 years earlier than they were going to. And I kind of was like, well, I'm going to ride this wave because it's probably the wave was going to hit anyways. So coming from like a more experimental base in New York, kind of working in there in London and running around, to seeing like where this could expand, because I mean it's a whole new network of people, it's a whole new industry, international industry of people, and in like a very dearly loved art form. But also right before I came, I did a virtual show it was a co-production between the Civilians Theater and Oregon Shakespeare Festival. So like really my first like couple weeks at LAIKA was literally me like in the evenings, like kind of on Slack, like helping organize this virtual production with OSF and the Civilians. So both, I don't know. Actually, I'm wondering like in terms of this, in terms of like kind of finding community, and knowing that theater is such a close-knit community. And what, like we were even saying, you meet someone else who works in theater and suddenly they kind of, your shoulders relax back and it's like, oh, you understand me. How have you found navigating the stop motion animation community, which is definitely also a very close-knit international network of artists?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, going back to what Anna was just touching on, we were laughing about this ahead of meeting with you all tonight, that the studio is, it's large. There are, I would say, we're probably close to 500 employees. right now. Not everyone's on site, but there's at least a couple hundred people on site. And when I started there, I didn't know anyone. And it was so odd to walk into a place where I didn't know anyone and I didn't know anyone who knew anyone, because it really was a different world of people. However, that instant community of finding someone else in the studio who you find out that their background was also in theater, there's just this moment that's like a high five, like, yes, okay, you're a theater person, you know what I'm talking about. And that kind of makes an instant attachment. But I'm not going to speak to how the rest of you are finding the community there. I will say that I've been at LAIKA now about 5 years, and the first year, at least, maybe the first 3 years, I don't know, I definitely felt like an imposter because I didn't come from that world. But to their credit, no one who was working there made me feel that way. It was certainly something that I put upon myself. But what was really fascinating was, much like my experience in theater, I feel like the stop motion world it's incredibly small. It is incredibly international. It's one of my favorite things about working there and about being in this environment. We have animators and artisans and designers from all over the world. They all know each other. And it does make it sort of it feels a bit like a club once you start to see the same faces, seeing them return from other projects that they've been on. You know, not everyone's there for the full duration. The duration of a stop motion film is, I don't know, 3 to 5 years for sure, you know, and not everyone's there for that same amount of time. It's really been fun and interesting to see people who cycle in and out based on what period of the production we're in. They're going off to some show that they're working on in Norway, and the animators get all split up. They do different things, they come back in. And so over time, I think you do get the sense that there is a lot of support and community for one another. But I would just say it's a different one. One thing that's interesting right now, and I don't want to steal too much of this if the others of you want to jump in on it, but what I find really interesting right now, and is a change from when I started there, is that there is a stop motion community that's really growing in Portland right now, or sort of centering itself a bit more in Portland now. We have several other large studios that are putting on feature films here. That's not something that used to be the case. LAIKA was kind of up here on its own with some, you know, there was some commercial work and places that were doing shorts and things like that. But those other shows and the backing of those studios up here has really kind of made this a place where I can see a lot of potential growth in that community, just based on the growth of what's happening now. I'll let somebody else talk.
I'll go. I think also I worked in Native communities, and I've worked in theater and just like visual art, and also like 2D digital animation. And I've met so many people at LAIKA that I have mutual connections with. Anna and I met, and we realized that we both knew Kate. There's another person I work with that he's worked with like my previous employers, and I'll follow someone on Instagram and see that we already have like a ton of mutual friends. So I think animation in general is like a really tight-knit community, and theater and visual arts. So I feel like even though I haven't worked in stop motion before, and sometimes when I'm in a meeting, I have no idea what anyone's talking about, everyone is extremely nice and very patient and willing to explain things. And I also think like you don't just stumble upon working at LAIKA. It's not like an accident. So everybody that works at LAIKA is there for a reason. And it's usually just because they love what they do, or they love the art form. And so people are so willing to just sit down and talk to you for 20 minutes about, you know, a very specific tiny thing they do, like why they chose a specific type of paint to paint on silicone, and why that one works and another one doesn't. And so, I mean, it's just like everyone just makes you feel really involved, even if you're not as involved. So it's like, I feel like it's very easy to make community at LAIKA and in stop motion, because we're all just weird artists that love to talk about our art forms.
Yeah, I think it helps a lot that nobody really goes to school for stop motion, right? Like, so everyone is aware that you've everybody starts somewhere and comes from some other background, that they're able to kind of move their skill set into this weird, nerdy, tiny little, alley essentially of art. So there's a lot of openness. There's a lot of willingness to explain and help out, I think, and I think that they also are always interested in the thing I've noticed is there's not a lot of there's a lot of willingness to think about another way, right? Like, oh, we could maybe do it that way. Oh, there is that thing that we could do. Or that thing that, oh yeah, we used to do that. We haven't done that in a long time. Maybe we should go back and try that again, and I think that that's because everybody's there to innovate, essentially. Like, that's part of what everybody likes about it, is that they're constantly trying to grow and they're trying to perfect, essentially. So that's my 5 cents.
Also, it's very interesting that in the model shop, I think we're like, especially down in the workshops in the art department, we're definitely in this position of like right now we're crewing up for more members as we get more sets coming through, as we get more builds coming through. So just being in constant discussion, just like on a practical standpoint with this world and like who they're looking at and in who they're looking at to hire, it's a very interesting conversation, especially because like who I work with, Keith McQueen, he's been there since Coraline. So he's kind of seen the waves of artists and everyone who's come through this building. And I came into that building knowing almost nothing about stop motion. What was very reassuring was kind of even being told the very first week of, don't worry, we kind of assume when you arrive that you probably don't know how this all works. Mm-hmm. So like the first like 6 months or so was almost like a crash course in like how stop motion and the intricacies and the idiosyncrasies of this art form work. And also in that way, even when they're looking at hiring and such, that means yes, absolutely, if folks come with a big portfolio and background in stop motion and have animated and are comfortable working not only on that scale, but that level of detail, that is a huge plus, but also that's not the only thing they're looking for. It's actually, there are product designers and industrial designers and illustrators and like theater prop makers. Actually, we just brought on a new model maker, and he has a primarily theater background as well. And he literally just came on Monday. So I would invite into this conversation, but we've only known each other for 3 days. And all I know is that hopefully he builds that bookcase well. But but no, I mean, he'll build it beautifully. However, he has a big like Portland Center stage and his whole entire portfolio going into their years, like for like 10 years. But I think in one sense, it's actually, it's artists, the terms of portfolios that they're looking at and folks they're looking at is passion and curiosity. Because you're constantly being asked to like, how would we do this thing that we haven't ever done before? And quite often the solution is the simplest one. And that in itself is like a really reassuring space, because there are no assumptions of like, what this is. It's almost like I'm back in the world of classics where like, yes, we know we're a little bit insane to be obsessed about this, but isn't it so much fun? Also, what's really nice about this environment is that everyone is like, the expectation is such excellence that all the artisans are just so incredibly talented that I can at least speak to those who are in the workshops. They're so talented that there's very little sense of competition, if any at all. It's more just admiration of each other. So you actually have people on their breaks will like come down, and mainly the model shops very much. We always have exciting things to show and to look at, but everyone just like goes around to like kind of ogle at each other's and geek out over each other's work constantly, and in no sense of competition, and just kind of a sense of like open admiration, which is just such a really wonderful environment. I mean, yes, absolutely, it definitely has its difficulties, but in the end of the day, that's such a beautiful place to be. And I actually think like in terms of like, I started talking about this in like, I brought this up even talking about resumes and stuff like that, because I think one of the things I found for myself when I was in this big pivot was I was like, great, I'm going to go pivot. I'm going to go find somewhere exciting and new and different. I have all this theater experience. I have all these practical skills. I can make something happen from nothing with a curtain opening in 3 days time. That's so transferable. And then I found like walking up against a lot of walls where no one could really tell what were my theater skills, what did that mean? And I found that actually LAIKA was one of the first ones that began like pointing out exactly everything I'd done and explaining why it was so great. And I was like, oh, wow, you understand me. And so I wonder how you all found that in terms of kind of redefining or re-looking at your theater skills when applying to a space like this, whether for the first time or for after multiple times.
I'll start this time. The first time I didn't get hired as a set designer strictly on my computer skills, honestly, because I don't use Vectorworks. And so there was, so I already sort of knew that the skill set was there. And I guess when I was looking at art direction, honestly, I online stalked the then art director. And she had been at LAIKA for a very long time, and I had done a few interviews online, had worked with Nelson Lowry, our production designer, for even in London when he was doing Mr. Fox in London. So I sort of stalked her and paid attention to what she was talking about, and then kind of talked about the same things. I mean, for art direction, it's designer skill set, but you're also sort of at a level where you're helping to manage a huge team, and the design team in particular, and knowing how to talk to them, and figuring out how to integrate all those different things, because we have set designers and prop designers and graphic designers, and we have visual illustration artists. So getting all of that into the same place is a big part of it. So it felt like being able to talk about set design and how that does all of those things. And then honestly, I had the added advantage of having taught for a very long time. So and I find myself using those skills a lot, because it's a lot of mentoring, and it's a lot of, I don't want to tell the designer how to do it. I'm not going to tell the set designer what to design. I hate it when people do that. I don't want anybody to make me their hands, right? So, but figuring out how to say just enough, but not too much, essentially, to kind of help drive people, particularly the younger designers, in the direction that the show needs them to go. I think that that all worked to my advantage, and just being able to have those conversations, essentially. So I had essentially stalked her just enough, and also Nelson somewhat, but definitely her, just to know that those were the conversations that I needed to be able to have. But it was less about my portfolio, because I wasn't super worried about that. Like, there's a real one-to-one correlation between a set for stop motion and a set for theater. And oh, by the way, I also build models in 1/4 inch, which makes most of them, their heads hurt. It's so tiny, they can't actually kind of even, they can't kind of even imagine functioning in that scale, right? So so that was kind of the easy part. On one level, it was the more sort of soft skills management stuff that I really had to kind of be able to talk about and be able to discuss. And so that was even a little bit, so that was a little bit easier in that respect. I didn't have to like explain my entire work. Like I didn't have to explain, everything I did to anybody. I was able to sort of use those corollaries.
Yeah. I'll jump in. Crossover skills, is that kind of like where you're going with this? Like what was good to bring in, what was recognized when I came in? I was thinking about this before we came into this tonight, thinking about like what were the similarities and the differences. And I started thinking about what I used when I came in, because I really felt like I was coming in cold to stop motion. Again, like you were saying, almost everybody who comes in here, well, okay, not everybody who comes in as an animator, obviously, but many people who come in don't come in with the background of having done stop motion. So there's always going to be this learning curve for people coming in. And I feel like what I used the most when I came in that I had gotten from theater, oddly enough, were the skills that I had when I was touring. So when I was a touring stagehand and using those on your feet skills where you're coming into a different city and you're meeting a different crew and the space is set up differently and there's a different problem to solve today, that actually translated the best for me into managing crews on the floor and dealing with the day-to-day shooting scenarios, because there was always going to be some unforeseen problem. There was always something that, when you left last night, you thought you were going to be walking into this in the morning. And then when you came in the morning, that wasn't the case anymore, because, the puppet you thought you were going to have had a piece that was broken and that wasn't going to be ready until lunchtime. And the, set dressers needed a little bit more time over here. And so that's the skill set of just sort of like listening, collecting, adapting, asking questions all the time. Those, I think we all do that in theater, right? Especially any of us who are doing physical production. It's the day-to-day, we're here now, this is the problem we have in front of us now, how are we going to solve it? That has been the thing that has just carried me through almost everything I've done in the different roles that I've had there. It helped to have a technical background to the degree that I felt like I had a fairly good understanding, even though some of these job roles are obviously different. But I do have at least a sense of how long it will take an artisan to do a certain task. Or, if someone says, we've decided that this entire set needs to be painted a different shade, we've got a team of scenic artists coming in tonight to do it. Like, just having an understanding that is not a small ask. That is not something that is going to be done in 2 hours. That might take 5 days. That was helpful. I felt like there were some people that I worked with who were sort of strictly production side, also many of them new to stop motion, who didn't come from a, let's say, like a craftsmanship or artisan background, or hadn't been around fabrication shops before. Maybe they've been working live action or something like that. And I could see them struggling with the understanding of why it was taking so darn long for someone to go in there and fix this thing. And that was just a really helpful knowledge base that I think made it a little bit easier for me to communicate with the crews and understand that sort of area. I think that coming in with that sort of willingness to listen and learn, and I just cannot say enough, I'm so grateful that when I did come into this space, there were so many people there who, they could have definitely written me off and said, this woman doesn't know what she's doing. She's, we don't have to give her the time of day. And no one ever treated me that way. All of my crews were really willing to teach me about what they did. And that made it really, gave me much more of an ability to support them, right? When I knew that my camera team would come to me and say, we've got to totally change around the key lighting in this room, then I was able to go back to production and say, I'm advocating for my people, this is what they need. And I think I had a great amount of trust I still do all the time there, have such a great amount of trust and respect for all of the people, because I think, touching on what one of you said earlier, there is no one there who isn't amazing at what they do. there is no reason for me to second guess how anyone is doing their job. And I think that is something that anytime you've had the pleasure in whatever your industry you're in to work with people who are really good at what they do, just taking that respect from place to place with you and assuming that the people you're coming across are doing their best. That's really what's gotten me through that too. Because I do want to say, like, we are all sitting here saying like, oh, it's great. These are great, but it's stressful. It's a really stressful environment. And that goodwill, I think that assuming benign intent toward one another, the assumption that everyone really is working their hardest and their best to achieve this level of sort of ridiculous perfectionism, it goes a long way. I think those are the crossover skills that help me the most. Maybe they're soft skills, I don't know, but that's what helped me the most.
Yeah, I actually, kind of jumping off of what you're saying, Erica, I feel like a sense of collaborative urgency is what's helped me the most. Because in theater, it's like I'd be working on painting a backdrop, and then all of a sudden the lighting comes on that's going to actually be the lighting for the scene, and then my colors are wrong and I got to change that out. Or a performer starts performing and rehearsing a scene, and then the colors don't fit the essence of the scene, and then I got to change it. Or, working more like in an assistant role, it's, we got to go get something else new because it doesn't fit in the scene anymore. And with theater, it's like you really have that one moment to perfect it. It's like you can work so hard, but if it doesn't all come together for that live performance, it's what was the point? So that perfectionism is very, very important leading up to it. And working at LAIKA, it's, we'll work extremely hard on a puppet, and then you put it under certain lighting and it just doesn't work, and that is stressful, and it can affect many people and stress many people out, but it is also a very real problem. And, if we're putting in all this work to make something, then it should be perfect, and we should put in the extra time to fix those issues and make sure that the lighting and the colors work and all kinds of lighting. And I think, my last job working in 2D animation, there was a sense of urgency there, but only because we could do it, because we were working digitally. We could make last minute changes and we could add in things because we wanted to. But working in stop motion and working in theater, the urgency is because of just the craftsmanship, and because we want to make something perfect, and because we are working all together. And working as an assistant now, oftentimes, it's like, oh, we need to get a picture of this in this kind of lighting because it didn't work, and we need to see if it'll work this time. And knowing that, like Erica said, it's benign. It's, it's just what has to happen to make this all work perfectly and make sure that we're all on the same page and we're all working towards the same goal. So that collaborative urgency definitely is a crossover skill from theater to stop motion.
So actually talking about kind of working all together, and also within what's within stop motion is like, you're kind of in this weird medium point between like 2D animation, where in CG animation, where you can just kind of do everything. And then there's like live action, where you obviously are inhibited by, say, gravity, in a way that puppets and puppetry. And I think one of the beauty about working in puppets, you do things that you can't do in the physical real world. But at the same time, everything like chairs and stuff and things, gravity applies and things apply, and reality and time applies. And I think I'd love to, I'm going to basically speak about, like, even in the collaborative process, the designing process, how actually the fact that in stop motion animation, you're trying to make static things look dynamic and active. And fundamentally, that really affects everything. And it really affects design in very fascinating ways that you don't until you begin working with it, you don't realize the difficulties that may be. And I really wanted, like, in a moment, Megan, I'd love to hear how that comes, like, in terms of like collaborating and working with designers, and we're concept artists and prop designers from the top. But I'm just going to quickly say that even like in the model shop, I think we get a lot of things where you get an idea, but it actually ends up becoming like this big roundtable collaborative discussion about an object and about a moment, and even about like a half-second shot where an object like so simple as like, I mean, literally, I think like a chair or a couch could be designed one way, but because it doesn't have all the rigging points and all these things, because it ends up being a technical challenge. Everything ends up being a technical challenge. So you have to be technically about everything. And actually that utility ends up really dictating a lot of forms. And people have to be willing to kind of give and take at the right moments in terms of designs to better kind of sneak in these suspension systems, to sneak in these access points, to manipulate and pull back that back so you can actually have that line running all the way back, so you can make that one material compress back a little bit more. Or even it comes to a set, being like, that's a beautiful set, but with that type of floor, we won't be able to get clean, like hidden lines in it. So we can actually pull away all those bits of floors. So we can have an animator get up and manipulate this moment and manipulate this moment and then pop that back in, or take away this ceiling piece so someone can get in and get that overhead shot while an animator comes in from this angle as well. So that ends up being this like logistical collaboration, which ends up informing a lot of forms. And you kind of, it really is that moment until you kind of get the final shot. But I know that I'm speaking of it from a practical level, because that's what we deal with day to day. Megan, I'd love to hear actually in terms from a design perspective, how that thought process begins. Oh, you're muted.
Okay. I think that it starts in a really similar place. I mean, the main difference, as far as I'm concerned, between what we're doing and what happens in a theater is scale and scope, right? It is such a huge project, and the you know, even different from live action, you know, the joke I make, because it makes me laugh and I don't really care what other people think, is that there is no tiny little prop truck, right? Like you cannot go to the prop truck and just pull out another prop if the dressing isn't there when it comes time to shoot. So you have to pre-plan everything and you have to design everything. And I think that the you know, the thing that happens is that it does all still start from the same place. You start with a concept. You start with, are we naturalistic? Are we styled? In my time at LAIKA, you know, we've done a variety of things. So sometimes it's a little more naturalistic. Sometimes it's got a really specific stylization to it. And if you're stylizing something, then you're talking about what are the rules of the stylization. And we're, you know, creating documents, honestly, we're doing some work. It's almost always that we're gonna build some stuff and decide what's working, and then spelunk backwards to what the stylization is, right? So as opposed to this kind of high concept thing that's all sort of happening up front, a lot of it is very practical. So because it's all about, is it actually working on camera, right? So that, I think, Anna, is the tie-in for design, right? On one level is, well, we have to make sure that it's actually going to do the job, because we can build the most perfect 1 to 5 replica of something, but on camera, it's not necessarily going to look real. It's going to have possibly too much detail, and we're going to actually have to subtract detail from it, because it may not work with the puppet, right? One thing or the other might tick, that it's not all in the same family, and it needs to be in the same family. You know, it's not real different than deciding on a style for a show and then communicating amongst your design team what that's going to be and how that might look and how it might translate from, you know, scenery to costumes to video to lights and sound. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, and I also find interesting that in like in the same thing you said, where because everything is made from scratch.
Yeah.
everything has to be thought out ahead of time, because you're asking every artisan with those information and details to make this thing the right way, in a way it's coherent across a whole film that's lasting across 5 years. I'm putting out long distance time, but like that relationship with time, I think one of the longer discussions is just kind of like a design drift could happen, because we naturally evolve over time. And in that case, even as it comes down to the workshops, what's been really interesting is that I feel like in theater quite often, especially because you have a prop store and you can pull things from there, and you can almost like discover your design. You have to know so much up front, but there's a lot of discovery in the way. We receive concept art, and that is, unless it's a company with caveats, is quite often considered the Bible, because you have so many artisans working on it at once that something needs to remain consistent. There's leeway and space and there's elbow room within that to discover and to find and to create a voice within that set. Still, we do receive that concept art that ends up kind of dictating, especially because we need to make sure that communication happens not only with us, but also with puppets and their timelines.
Well, and this is a trick that Nelson uses, and we haven't gotten there yet with this show, but we will eventually put together a unit for just that reason, because you're working on such an extended timeline. And it's not just for the physical build, it's also for VFX, right? Like, we're all going to finish in 2.5 years, but they're going to keep going for another 2 to, I don't know, 10 right now.
On this one.
Don't say that. Don't say that.
Two.
So they're, you know, and they have to make sure they don't drift. And we, you know, the art direction team has to make sure that they're not drifting, and that we're not drifting. So one of the things that will eventually happen is that there will be a unit on one of the stages that is just sort of best of, you know, these are the things, these are the objects that we have created that exemplify the style. These are the pieces of art that are the best examples of what we're doing, so that literally anybody can walk through that thing at some point and help remind themselves, you know, or, you know, we as art directors can kind of utilize that and say, well, you remember on this thing that's on the unit, it needs to be a little bit more like that. So it becomes a referent for everybody.
Yeah, and
to just help with that issue.
I was going to say too that it's interesting, because hearing about it when you just said something about design drift, Anna, I thought I could completely see that happening, right? We design these sets and roll these sets out over years. I mean, we have so many. I don't even remember how many locations are in this show. There will be hundreds of sets, but everything takes so long to make. I want to bring it back around a minute to puppets, because puppet design and character design, that also, you know, that's all heavily front loaded, right? All of these concept designs and character designs have to get approved before they ever start building even the armature inside of a puppet. But the puppets also get duplicated, right? We need multiples of these puppets. And so, for instance, the main character in this film that we're currently working on, I don't know, Stasia, do you remember how many copies they're going to be of that puppet? I would say something like 30, maybe more than that. And we can't make them all at the same time, right? So those designs get approved early on as well, and they roll on in a sequence as well based on how soon we need them for shooting. But there has to be consistency, like incredible duplicated consistency that has to stay throughout the entire build process and run. And so the puppet that's going to land in set number 40 is the exact same, has to look identical to the one that is in the set that landed first, right? No matter how many years it may be or months it may be later when they're shooting, because that's the same person, that's the same character, that's the same living being, you know, that's going to be animated there. And so that the timelines may be very different, but we're so interdependent on one another. We have to kind of stay in lockstep, which is a really hard thing to keep hundreds of creative people doing and keeping them in line. But I think that the production design, incorporates also the character design and those same rules that you were talking about, Megan. When you find the rules, the style rules, those same style guidelines inform what the puppets look like as well, including things like, the line of how the arms are going to be shaped and things like that. Those are all dictated to sort of work together as a whole. And so it's almost like each of those departments and worlds has to keep one another in check to make sure that we're staying together on those things. And that it also comes down to things like our costume design and the costume, the materials, the fabrics that get designed and made in-house, those also have to match all of those same rules and work in consort. And part of what I do has to do with the weird places where we intersect. So I work predominantly with puppets, but also with rigging, which is our department that really facilitates the movement of all of these things. So anything that's out there on a set that is going to move is probably going to be rigged at some point. And I think what you were mentioning also, Megan, about the fact that everything that gets designed has to be able to move. And that idea of how it's going to move has to come in the very initial conversations. So I think it's important to point out that animation is also in these conversations all the time. Animation is there. The leadership in that team is there for us to ask questions of. They bring their expertise in. It's iterative. It's so iterative. I mean, every single part, every piece, every puppet, every part of a puppet, every wig of a puppet, every prop that a puppet's going to hold, every set piece that has to move, animation gets consulted on all of that just to make sure that the practicality that you're talking about is kind of baked in, has to be baked in. And I mean, animation will always win. You might have the best, most beautiful design, but animation will always win because it's not, I don't mean that it's a competition, but it's just that the hierarchy of needs says that if we can't make this thing move right, and we can't get the artistry out of it that we want, it's not going to fly. We're going to make it again and again and again until it moves right.
Yeah.
Don't you dare put tassels on anything.
I mean, I wouldn't want to animate a tassel. You wouldn't get me to do that.
Just like you see tassels and their shivers, just like you never look at tassels the same way again. Never look at keys the same way again.
Right.
Well, I'd also like to point out that surfaces are important. Things like snow and mud and sand and water are terrible surfaces for us to be using, and yet we keep putting them in our films. I used to joke that I wanted our next film to be completely concrete. All of the surfaces, all of the sets would be concrete because it was very, very easy to manage from a stop motion perspective.
So we've actually got a couple of questions in the chat, and I know we're going to have kind of time at the end for some open questions, but I just thought throw these in. Sam, I think we're going to finish up talking about your question. I think that's kind of like going and like just saying that, yes, that is absolutely a discussion point that we're all having. Yeah, and I think that there are many, like, I think this kind of touch on that briefly for those who might have seen that in the chat. The having more studios in the space, going from like a one-stop shop, has definitely changed the nature of being at LAIKA in terms of artists, in terms of sharing artists, in terms of artists kind of going away and the attitude of artists leaving, and also in terms of pay. When you start bringing up people from bigger studios into a small town, this company no longer has a monopoly, and that definitely changes rates of pay and having negotiations. Which I mean, it's not easy for any company to kind of, yes, we'll touch upon that, but saying, yeah. But also even like mentioning, this is interesting. So we're not the only kind of the puppetry in the area. Interesting, someone mentioned Michael Curry. And we just had one of our technical, our metal welders leave to go work on big puppets. And Michael Curry, Jason. So there's a lot of crossover with that as well. I think quite a few people at LAIKA have worked at Michael Curry.
Yeah, actually, side note, the thing that actually got us to Portland was my partner was working for Michael Curry at the time. And that's what actually got us sucked up to Portland to begin with. He also incidentally worked at LAIKA, but does no more. There is a certain amount of crossover. It's interesting. The only thing different really is the scale. I mean, it's not the only thing different, but you know, the skill sets are so similar, and we do tend to have, it's not a super huge flow, but there's definitely been a flow of people who have gone back and forth between the two places. So it's certainly they're known to one another, and whenever we're hiring or they are hiring, we end up trying to poach from the same pool of fantastic, talented people.
It's one of those things where everyone always knows somebody is working on other, like Wendell and Wild, which is one of the films, and Pinocchio, which is one of the films, and LAIKA is one of the films, and there's a lot of like, and Michael Curry, there's a lot of crossover happening between all the studios.
Yeah, Pinocchio, people are rolling on to Wildwood from Pinocchio, but that's partly just because they've rolled off of Pinocchio, right? Like the two kind of schedules have aligned in such a way that it's kind of a natural, it's a natural role. And I think Wendell and Wild is still working, aren't they?
Yeah, they're some of their folks are about to roll off as well, because we'll be getting some animators who are finishing up there, and I know some production folks from our side who went over to Wendell probably about 1.5 years ago. And they will shortly be finishing up. And it is interesting. I mean, I think we're touching on the question right now, right? Like, what does it mean to have these competing shows and this community that's building in Portland? Personally, I think it's great. I think it allows more cross-pollination, and it allows a bigger pool of people and ideas flowing. And I'm excited to see that. I do think it will be, maybe it's cliche, like the water, you know, the rising tide, rising all the boats. But on a practical, trying to run a show part, it's been hard because we're competing for the same talent, and people are, I think a couple of us have touched on it. Pandemic made people make different choices, you know, and those, it's interesting now to see as some of those other shows are starting to wind down. I think there used to be a sense at LAIKA when they were the only game in town, or they were the biggest stop-mo player, that people would drop anything to come here and work for LAIKA. And I think that it's been a little bit of a new paradigm that they've had to face, to realize that people will make choices to go and try other things, and that I think we will be better for it when we can get them back, right? They may come back with new ideas. They may come back with different ways of solving these problems that I find very exciting. So I'm not sure how ready LAIKA was as a company to be able to face that sort of fighting for talent. But now I think we're at a great spot, because we've got so many talented folks here in town that hopefully, if we're lucky, we'll get some of them back.
Yeah, I think it's also made a window for people to get into it who might not have before. I know I have a number of people that I work with in theater who have started at LAIKA, in part because of that. There was a dearth at one point. Or because, you know, people who were in Portland to do stop motion decided they didn't want to do it anymore, or they decided they didn't want to be in Portland anymore. But I think that because of the schedules and the way that the schedules of these 3 films have worked out, I don't think that we've actually hit the highest pressure point at this point. I think we're feeling it, but nobody has decided to, like, they're not on exactly the same trajectory, or we're not at the height of production, and somebody else starts really up, you know, and ups the game. So we don't yet know how all of that is going to play out, I think.
It's interesting when even like you're talking about, Megan, how within LAIKA there's actually quite a lot of artists with theater backgrounds who have recently signed on.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's always, I mean, I definitely like, there many will say, oh yeah, I did a bit of theater, then I found myself in film. I did a little bit of theater, I found myself in film. But a lot of people, like even Mike, who just went model shop and was on Wendell and Well before,
Mhm.
was was also was a very prominent, like working in props.
Yeah, he
and-
was the props master at PCS.
Yes,
What Mike,
yeah,
that was
exactly.
what Mike did.
Yeah. He
Yeah.
knows like everybody, and everybody knows him, and it's great
Yeah.
because I don't know him. So I
Wait. Are you saying you just hired Mike?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
He started
Yeah.
on
Hello.
Monday. He
That's
started on
great.
Monday, Erica.
Yeah.
No,
Come
sorry,
on,
sorry, everyone.
Come
Yeah.
hang with us.
Sorry.
I bring
Sorry.
cookies. So anyways, but what I think is also just interesting, just to kind of acknowledge, I think what's happening is like in LAIKA and in stop motion, with a lot of these artists with theater backgrounds and all of this incredible knowledge and experience of knowing how to work to create super hard to crazy deadlines, one after the other, like balancing, like if you're like freelance, especially designing stuff like 5 or 6 shows at once, is and with a pandemic, for various reasons, whether a necessity or even just like general kind of curiosity. I mean, I know for myself, curiosity about other industries, how that kind of finding their way out of theater main time and into other industries, how that's going to affect them. I think I was talking to Erica that I was been in conversation with a number of like VR AR developers, and they find there's actually a lot of tech-minded people developing work, but not a lot of like who wears like the strong foundation in like storytelling. And story doesn't have to become like indirectly and like writing a play or directing a play, but like knowing the narrative behind a choice.
Mhm.
And coming from a discipline and a career where narrative, even behind small choices, is just so imbued, and how that will affect in when folks find themselves working in different areas that didn't have that narrative, the trained like artists with narrative bases like that before, how that will shift and change them and what opportunities lie. I don't know what any of your thoughts on this.
I mean, I used to do commercial work too. So, I mean, I did trade show exhibits at one point, and I've done a fair amount of, not a fair amount, I've done some ad agency work as well. And that is what they are after, right? Is that visual storytelling is essentially, is how I tend to talk about it. And that has been a really strong, really helpful thing to be able to figure out how to talk about and how to communicate beyond even just stop motion or theater or whatever.
I think I just want to say, like, I actually did work in VR for a bit. I did a lot of 360 videos, and I think people from my generation are no longer just focusing on one industry or one art form. And so I feel like there's going to be a lot more of the crossover careers where you work in theater and TV and film and VR and video games. And I think it's going to create some interesting art, because I know a lot of people, when I think of VR, sometimes I just think of video games and just, not the best parts of society. But I went to a VR festival, and there was a piece where you were put a headset on and like a vest, and you were supposed to be like a tree. You were like a seed, and you grew up into a tree, and you got to experience yourself being a tree in a forest. And it's like, that reminds me of something like in theater, like a one-person show where they're a tree and they, and they perform it. And that to me is going to be so interesting to see those different voices telling different stories in different art forms. And there's like the technical ability that people have access to now, but there's also more of an acceptance of like, just because you didn't study theater in school and like you studied under people and went to a specific city to do this, like that doesn't really exist anymore, especially with the pandemic and people moving all over the country and back home. I'm really interested to see like more people from my generation and younger generations, what they're going to do with these different forms of storytelling.
I love that. I love that you touched on the fact that location is much less, I think, going to be the incubator and the driver than it was previously. I think that's definitely something that we're going to see.
Thank fucking God. Pardon me.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah, it's something, I don't know, it's something I think about readily all the time as fellows, like Anastasia, like yourself, like coming from so many, dabbling and playing around in so many different areas, and people always asking like, so when are you going to make a choice? So when are you just going to stay in one area and one lane? And it's like, but that sounds really fun.
Right. One of my favorite things about the tech guys and the sort of tech industry that I dealt with when in advertising was that, you know, they would ask you, how long have you been doing that gig? And I've been at LAIKA now for 3 years. And just like 2 months ago, somebody said to me, man, that's a really good run. Right. They're like, you haven't moved on, you know. So I feel like they're like, finally my people, sort of. You know, I don't have, my attention span is not necessarily for that sort of long haul. I want to try something new. I want to do something new. I'm ready to do something different. I have always wanted to get my hands on some of those horrible game designs. Those backgrounds, those environments are god awful. So many of them are so bad. Haven't figured out.
And so many of them are so beautiful now that I'm just stunned. And I find myself saying, okay, it's time for me to give video games a ton of credit, right? Like,
right.
I mean, again, it's just like, it's pushing where design, where I feel like we may have once put categories in our heads, right? Of like, where is the good design going, and where's the cheap design going? And now it's just like, it doesn't matter the genre or the medium, really. It has the potential to be anywhere.
Yeah.
I did want to just throw out one other thing that I feel like, if there are any theater practitioners who are considering moving into stop motion, I feel like it's an important thing to bring up, and that's time. Sense of time is really, really different. Megan, you just said about it being a 3 years is a really good run, right? Like,
yeah,
I knew coming into it that the length of time of a project and the length of time between when you were really putting in the sweat and when you were going to see that final product or that payoff was going to be different. But I cannot tell you, I was really underprepared for the glacial pace.
Totally glacial.
And I mean, even in terms of like decision making, and because it's endlessly iterative, right? Like, there are no butts in seats at 8 o'clock tomorrow night. It is, you never have to stop iterating, because you can always spend a little bit more time, right? And which can make the show extend indefinitely. But it was one thing that I found really challenging at the beginning, was figuring out how to pace myself, because it was such a long time that these groups of people were going to be working on the same mindset, same world, same project. And yet it was like the energy level and urgency level of tech month, but for like a year and a half, you know, every single day felt like that. And it was challenging to find those moments that were ways to celebrate, right? When you have such a long project, how do you find something to get everyone rallied behind, you know, like you do when you have your successful dress rehearsal or whatever, because it's going to take months and months and months and months. And when you get to the end of a week of shooting, when we're finally up in like full production, you get to the end of a week of shooting and they show you all of the shots that we finished this week, and the entire amount that they showed you, yes, is like 6 seconds long, and you're like, wow, that's it. And then you look around at your colleagues and you're like, it took hundreds of us, it took us months and months and months to create this. And that's that was just something that I just want to warn y'all, if any of you are considering the stop motion world, it takes some recalibrating. That sense, I think that's something that I found almost all theater folks coming in, there's this sense of like, have we not Have we not decided this yet? Have we not made this like, are we there? Because you're just not used to having so many months and years to make these choices and make this
Yeah.
stuff.
And what I'm about to say is, even within stop motion, is unusual because of the circumstances of the pandemic. And we were, but pre-pandemic, we were working on one show, and then we switched mid-pandemic and went into pre-production on Wildwood. But that said, I have been at LAIKA for 3 years. I have yet to see a set on a unit that I started.
But you will.
3 years.
Coming very
3
soon.
years. Supposedly.
Yes.
Supposedly.
Yes.
I'm gonna believe it when I see it. But yeah, it's really different. Erica's right, and everything feels very. I mean, I feel like with the, it's somewhat similar in any industry. I found that everybody thinks that their form of urgency is the most urgent, and I think the response of anyone who's done theater is, "What are you wigging out about? Like, we have got months. Like, you've got to be kidding me. I can do, like, I would normally have done 8 projects in the time period that it has taken you to make one decision, right?" So it's definitely, there is a recalibration that way. And just since we're on the subject, and well, it's not the same subject exactly, but it is, if you're thinking about moving and stop motion is a thing you're interested in, I would also warn that it is not either, it is not more diverse, it is less diverse than theater, and it is possibly more sexist than theater at this point. So just as a fair warning, it's definitely, there's animation's got a boys club.
Yeah, I think it's I mean, I'm assuming this is a topic that we can discuss in here, right?
This is when, I mean, we get into the nitty gritty. We all have a time limit in this,
Yeah.
and we want to leave. This is such an important subject to talk about. And Anastasia, you're about to jump on.
Yeah. Anastasia, please, if you.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I've been working here for less than a year, but most of the time I've been spending organizing and figuring out how to create puppet stand-ins that will never be seen on the screen, and making lots of decisions about those and perfecting them. And in this amount of time working in TV, I had made a whole season of television. So, and in theater had done many shows. So it is definitely like something to get used to. And also speaking about the diversity, I mean, I've worked in theater on like practically all women shows. I've worked with almost all native theater productions. So it is, and we're also like in Portland, which has a reputation. So that is something to consider and to think about and mentally prep yourself for.
Yeah, I would echo all of that too. And I would say that, again, there is a diversity in the fact that we are not very American, right? We have a lot of folks from a lot of different countries. I find that part really fascinating. But yes, we are in Portland. We are predominantly very white. I would agree. Animation has been traditionally very male dominated, particularly if you look at the artists. So I consider the animators are the equivalent of the actors, really. That's the one for one in this industry. On the last film I worked on, which was Missing Link, we had, I want to say 33 animators in total. 2 of them were women. So that is certainly something that I know LAIKA is working on changing. I'm already seeing that change in makeup in the animators that they're bringing on. It's not just in animation. It is something that I see there. The company is 15 years old, I think maybe 16 years old now. A lot of the folks who are there in the management positions and the sort of heads of the departments, many of them are people who've been there for 10 years or more. And I find myself in an interesting role. I work with the coordination teams a lot. And if I'm in a meeting that is mostly managers or heads of departments. Sometimes I look around that meeting and I'm like, oh, I'm the only woman. It's a bunch of men and me. And if I'm in a room of people who are coordinating that work, it's a bunch of women. I think we got one. I think we got one guy.
It's weird whenever we have those weekly meetings and we sit down and I look like it's all women who are the coordinators.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think again, there's changes to be made. But if you take a step back and you sort of fuzz that lens a little bit, you're like, oh, it's bosses and secretaries, isn't it? And that's
I'm happy that's your thought process as well.
Yeah. I mean, but you know what, I will say it's certainly not 100% across the board. Our head of story is a woman, but it's just one of those things that I see that I think we still have a really long way to go. And I think we've worked. One thing I will say positively, and I don't know if this is everyone's experience there, I do think that there's a really good culture within this company for allowing people to express their voices. And I do see a pretty good, it can be very top down, but I do see a pretty good respect for lots of people getting to speak up in a meeting, right? Lots of people getting to share their bit. And I think that it can be very hierarchical. I think any large institution can, that's always going to be the way. I do see that there is respect for other voices in the room, but I do also see that there is, until some people move on from the positions they're in, there's always going to be a block at the top from more diverse people moving into some of those upper roles. That's kind of where it is.
So actually leaving with this, I know consider everyone's giving up their time. If you're on the East Coast, it's getting quite late, but we've already fielded some really great questions and really great comments, touching upon a number of things so far. However, I would say at this point, if anyone, you can turn on your video, you can write in the chat, anything like that. If you have any questions, that's also why we're here, is this supposed to be useful for us to kind of consolidate and share experiences, but also to just provide any information that we hold, because we've just been like, it's worth sharing. So yeah, if anybody has any questions or anything.
There was one question in the chat earlier that I wanted to answer that was about, is it more collaborative than traditional film, than live action? And I would say yes and to that. It is, but I think that's primarily, and at least in large part, I think that's because of our production, our production designer. That is his preference. Nelson has done possibly more stop motion than anyone else in the building, at least, if not just in general. He has been doing it for a very long time. And his feeling about it is that it is almost an impossible task without that collaboration, essentially. And also it comes from, at this point, a really deep respect for everyone in the shops and the craftspeople and artisans. I think that, that I've only been there for 3 years. I'm not gonna tell the model makers who've been there for 15, who did Coraline, how to do their thing, right? I'm happy to help them problem solve, but if they're interested, my preference would be that they problem solve. So I think that's part of it. Like, the scenic artists are amazing. They will come up with an entire backstory for like drips of dirt down a wall that I would never have time to do. And they do that because they want to, and because it helps them do their job, and it helps them do it really well. So I do think that it's more collaborative in that way. And that also, rolls over to the designers. Nelson is much more interested in having people come to him with solutions that they think will solve all the problems and work, rather than questions. So there's asking, kind of I need a little bit more direction kind of questions, but he really loves it when people say, hey, I did this thing. I think this is going to solve all the things. And then we go from there. He much prefers that kind of an approach. Anyway, that was mine.
Any other questions from those who are listening in? Any at all, other than thank you. Well, thank you for saying thank you. Oh no, no, but thank you all for joining and listening to us talk about this. It's kind of nice because we do exist in a little studio, quite large studio
studio bubble up here in the Northwest.
Do any of us have questions for each other? Actually, I realized anyone, us four want to raise to each other. Oh, are there any older folks? Actually, yes, this is the thing. This is actually, I love this, is in the model shop. I can speak to this from the model shop in terms of age. I find that theater, I mean, especially certain areas and like the kind of the bottom heavy area of theater is a lot of younger artists. But in stop motion, especially at LAIKA, I think I tend to find myself quite often in discussions and in teams, one of the youngest. And also like in the model shop, I think at least half the artists are over 40, getting over 50. So, and also because, I mean, amazing, it's just, especially because it's model shop, it's like to be a model maker means you have to be so incredibly knowledgeable, not only about materials, but about how to manipulate them and to manipulate them on a tiny scale and make them convincing on a small scale. So for that reason, hands down, our best model makers are our older model makers, and we really bring on younger model makers to learn from them.
Yeah, I would agree. There's definitely a cross section of ages, I think there. I would say that as in any physical industry, right, you have that potential to sort of like your body starts to age out. And I think what's fascinating about the scale of the work that we're doing in stop motion is you can probably do it a little bit longer, right? Like we're not hoofing around 50-pound stage weights all the time. This stuff's pretty small. And if it's bigger, we're automating it. We're using like motion control rigs and things like that. But yeah, definitely on our last show had some of our camera teams who have, 30, 40 years of experience, in shooting stop motion. And that's, again, it's a pretty specialized world, even though people come in from lots of different industries. So there can tend to be a kind of a longevity in it.
Mm-hmm. Puppets and models created as an overall vision are separate designers. It's generally an overall vision of the production designer. He definitely has we have someone who's doing character design is what it's called. And he is a little bit more separate than that position might have been on previous shows. It's definitely all under the aegis of the production designer. And one of the things that they've done in the past that's really interesting is sometimes they pull in a completely separate artist who creates a style, right? Who is from comics was one, right? Who created then a style for the film. And that's then the production designer takes that style and kind of expands on it and moves it forward in that way too, which I think is a fascinating thing.
Yeah, and we have Debs, so we do have a costume designer as well. So like even in terms of like moving down from that, and I find that, I'm not in the costume department. That is considered like a separate department, and they work, oh my goodness, we're talking primarily in like props and sets and things, but like The costumes, they're like, the shoes, they're exquisite. We have to make duplicates of them, grumble, grumble, but still means I get to hold them. Yay, yay. And so although like Thibaut, who's our character designer, may come up with a lot of the ideas of a lot of the clothing, but he works with Debs to design the costumes and pull references. So she very much, and she's been involved, I think, since Coraline.
Yes, since Coraline. Yeah, Deborah Cook. She's been, I believe, the costume designer on all of the now 6 feature films at LAIKA.
Well, yeah. Well, you know what? This feels then like a good time. We've covered an expanse of, I mean, we could probably talk on for ages about all of this, but by the sound of it, enough useful information for you all to walk away and think, is that really what I wanted? Would I want to do that? Would I want to put myself through that amount of time? I'm not sure, but it is magical. I think there's the beauty of stop motion is that I think stop motion at its best is that it shows there's a lot of human imperfection at play. And that is really where the magic comes. If the magic comes from, I think that's ultimately with theater, it was beautiful as you, that flowing, that ebb and flow between belief and disbelief and suspensions of disbelief. And it's the same way where with stop motion, where there's those small twicks and twitches and this organicness that really brings in the soul. So you kind of pull away for a moment when you notice them and you pull the story and the characters and the beauty pulls you back in a way that I think inherently is just so theatrical, which is a beautiful thing. And hopefully I can end us on that. And hopefully, unlike the beginning, not muck up the ending. This is a wonderful, thank you all for staying this whole entire time. I'm just gonna end with a little bit about us, about Wingspace. I'd say LAIKA, watch out for the next film. You will be in kind of hobbling away at that point in whatever time period in which it finally happens. It's such a big film. But that being said, you can still follow everything that LAIKA is doing. They still do public screenings. They do screens, I mean, it's not public screenings of films. They have tours of the objects. I would say you saw some of the behind the scenes now. You've heard about some of the behind the scenes now. If you ever have the opportunity for one of the touring shows to come through, many of our friends have made those things and are still working at LAIKA, and just the craftsmanship itself, it's like mind-blowing. You just like look at me like, did a human make that? This being said, Wingspace has lots of things going on as well. We have upcoming salons. And so you can follow everything we're doing. We post them all the time. We're trying to do one a month now for the rest of this year. We went really gung-ho with the virtual salons during like kind of COVID times and stuff. And now we're kind of easing into really wonderful conversations. We talk a lot about community. We talk a lot about activism. We talk about the design. Edward's going to join in.
Oh, just to say our next one on February 24th, I believe, a related to salon to this, we're talking to a number of designers, theater designers saying, what's your sideline? And we're talking to a Broadway sound designer who works on This American Life. We're talking to lighting designers who work in industrials, set designers who do architectural lighting, and that sort of thing. It'll be a great conversation. Put in your calendars for Thursday, February 24th.
Also want to say that in terms of like everyone we have here, we do actually give them a contribution for their time and for their knowledge and for their energy. So, but it's paid out a lot of times out of our members' Wingspace pockets. So if you want to, again, mention you can donate to us through PayPal. Information is going to be put up in the chat. You can join our mailing list to hear about more exciting things that are happening. We have a mentorship scheme. So I think that's actually really wonderful. We have a whole mentorship program. So if you know anybody, emerging designers, artists, theater practitioners who want to get involved with that, we have an incredible body of members who are just really enthusiastic to help out and pass on their knowledge and experience and also learn from new minds and new energy. So we'll say like that. And also, if you, again, you heard about what our upcoming salon is, we have more openings throughout the course of this year and in future, hopefully in future, we have a space in Brooklyn, so we're going to have in person again, but for right now, we're maintaining with virtual. But you can always email us at Salons to get that information. So finally, I want to just like take a moment to thank everybody for coming along, all of you for coming along. I want to say thank Anastastia, thank you for staying and talking and everything like that. Erica, thank you for staying, for talking and everything like that. Megan, thank you for staying, talking, for everything like that. I will see you all tomorrow, right back in the studio. And also for another day, we'll get something done, I think. And also I want to thank Wingspace. I want to thank Edward, thank you. Kate Pitt, thank you. Kate Freer, thank you. Thanks for helping moderate all of this. Yeah, and also all of our artists, like if you look in the website and things, you can find information about us. You can always reach out to us for questions. As I said, we all love to share our knowledge. So with all of that, thank you and good night.